So we got to keep them in our prayers and do everything we can to encourage them. And other than that, all I'll say is that he served God faithfully. Again, from what I understand, most of his life, if not all of his life. And so when somebody like that passes away, it's a learning experience. It's a time to reflect on the good things they did. It's a time to reflect on how they persevered in the faith. It's a time to reflect on the various trials that they encountered throughout their life and somehow still remained faithful, and looking to their example of what it means to serve God to the best of your ability. And so let's reflect on those things as we think about healing as well. And so with that, I'm going to kind of make an abrupt transition somehow into talking about 1 Kings class here. So go ahead and open up your Bibles to 1 Kings. It's my first Sunday back, as I understand. Brian did a really, really good job. I appreciate Brian Sipe filling in for me. And I'm hoping that, I was a little bit worried when he filled in for me, only because you guys tell me that I was doing a good job in teaching class, but the reality is that this book almost teaches itself. It's easy to teach, and so I saw Brian did a really great job, and so we're just working with really great material here, going through this book, and just a lot of good application. And I think that we're going to see that even more as we now have these prophets and have these kind of spiritual minority, so to speak. And that's what you have with Elijah at this time. He's becoming kind of this spiritual minority. Is you have so many of his brothers, fellow prophets, are being put to death. And that is talked about when he talks to Obadiah, who's one of King Ahab's servants. And Obadiah, he helped hide some of the prophets of God. And so you have Elijah, and he's continuing to persevere. You can imagine if you were a prophet of God and you're seeing other prophets being put to death, what would be a popular thing to do at that point? Stop being a prophet of God, right? But what does Elijah do? He just gets louder. And so that's why we love Elijah, because he's not backing down. Although he's not perfect, we're going to see in chapter 19, we're not going to read about this today, but in chapter 19, he does get a little timid at times. But through prayer and encouragement from God, he perseveres, and he's bold, and he does what God asks him to do. But as I understand, you all left off somewhere around verse 20 of chapter 18 in 1 Kings. And that, of course, is when it's setting up this showdown between those 450 prophets of Baal. I think it's actually 850 prophets in total, because you have two different kinds of prophets there. Versus one prophet of God and Elijah. And I just kind of want to back up just a few verses. As you guys have talked about several things, we won't go into really any of those as far as Elijah's introduction and his conversation with Obadiah and all of that. But you see that he does go through Obadiah to set up this meeting, and he finally gets this meeting with Ahab. And I find it interesting. I find it relatable as far as what Ahab eventually has to say to Elijah. But before we talk about that, I just want to clarify and point out the obvious, right? You see those commercials with Captain Obvious. And so here I am, Captain Obvious, saying Ahab is clearly wrong. And we know that he's wrong. We see a pattern of evil behavior. It says that he marries Jezebel, who is the daughter of Ethbaal. That was her dad's name. And that literally means, I think it means belonging to Baal or something along that line. And so you see that he marries into this family whose allegiance is with this false god. And it says that he did it as though it were a trivial thing, like, no big deal. When in reality, it's a huge deal. And so that's kind of your first big indication of how terrible Ahab really is. And then the other thing that you see, and I don't know if you guys talked about this or not, but under his reign, he allows an individual to go back and rebuild the city of Jericho, which God, when that city was destroyed, said if anybody rebuilds this city, his firstborn, his lastborn will be put to death. And that's exactly what happens for that individual who did that. But Ahab allowed that to happen under his reign. And you better believe that people understood the statement that was made against that city, understood why that city still lay desolate, that if they touched it, then some of their descendants are going to be put to death by the judgment of God. And Ahab still just allows somebody to go about doing that. Just total disregard. and doesn't care about the word of God at all. He's just made up in his mind that he's going to disobey and he's going to be stubborn in that disobedience. And one of the reasons I also say that he's clearly wrong is because at this time I have Deuteronomy 28, 22 through 24. But at this time, what is going on in the land of Israel? What are they experiencing? In one word. What? Drought. Yeah, no rain, right? So the whole nation is suffering, right? You're not getting new crops. Food is running low. Bad things happen when you don't get rain in the nation of Israel. And by the way, when somebody knocks the Pacific Northwest, I always tell them that rain is the sign of a blessed nation, is what I always tell them. But you see that that's going on at this time, and Elijah, he prophesies that the rain is going to cease. But this is something that was already said to Israel that would happen if they turned their heart away from God to follow false gods. And that's exactly what's being talked about in the context here of Deuteronomy, that if they don't keep the word of God, if they turn their heart away from God to follow other gods, then it lists a whole list of things that are going to happen. And there, among other things, it says, the Lord will make the rain of your land powder and dust. What does that mean? There's no moisture, right? There's no water. You're going to experience drought. You're not going to have crops. He's not going to. It's one of the ways God blesses the nation of Israel. He says, I'm going to make the rain stop if you turn away from me. And so you look at that and you say, well, Ahab, when is he going to get it? Because he's turned his heart away from God. He's following this false god. He's married into a family who has strong allegiance towards the false god of Baal. And the rain has stopped. Now you would think that he'd be familiar with warnings such as this. But I want to ask you, when God starts listing all these things that are going to happen if they don't worship him, if they don't remain loyal to him, why does he do that? Why does he say all these terrible things are going to happen and then follows through with that when they do that? Is it just because he's harsh? No. Why?
He wants them to repent, number one, and come back to him. And if they don't, then he disciplines them.
Yeah, exactly. Why do we have, why is it that we have nerve endings in our body that when we stick our hand in a flame, our brain tells us to pull it away? Because if I don't do that, then I'm going to catch on fire. I'm going to die. When God has all these warnings and all these bad things that are going to happen to him, it's not just like, oh man, I'm just going to take vengeance on you guys. This is going to happen. This is going to happen. This is going to happen. It's so that they'll hopefully turn back to Deuteronomy and say, oh, God said that if we turn away from him, then these terrible things are going to take place. These terrible things are taking place right now. We're probably not doing what we ought to be doing then, right? Isn't that what you should conclude? In other words, these types of things are meant to happen so that they'll wake up and turn their hearts back to God. But that's why I say Ahab remains stubborn in his worship to Baal, because even though he's experiencing this drought, when he's worshiping the god of fertility, right? They believe that he was like the storm god and the sun god. Even though he's worshiping him, they're still experiencing three years of drought. And so at what point is he going to wake up and get it? Well, the reality is he never really does, but the hope is that the other people of God will wake up and see that and see, well, wait a second, this isn't how it's supposed to be if we're doing what God tells us to do. But that's the situation they find themselves in, and so we really conclude that the reason why there is drought, obviously, is because they're worshiping false gods. They're not doing what God told them to do, and so that's why I find it so ironic that, hold on, I'll skip through this and come back to it. That's why I find it so ironic that when Ahab first sees Elijah, the first thing he says is this you troubler of Israel? Like Elijah somehow is bringing all these problems upon Israel. Can we relate to that sometimes? And that's why I want to go back to this other slide. So when we're wrong, obviously we understand what the right thing to do is, right? This is obvious again. We acknowledge that we are wrong, we accept consequences, and we make the appropriate changes. In other words, we right the wrong, right? Another word to sum that up perhaps is repentance, right? Change your mind, change your ways, reform your ways. But now the wrong thing to do, and we've seen this, is that we deny that we did anything wrong to begin with, right? And perhaps we don't do it verbally, but perhaps it's as simple as just not acknowledging it. We just ignore. And then we, based off of that, we continue in our stubbornness. And that's what we see Ahab doing. Instead of turning back to God, he doubles down, and he's worshiping Baal. And when that happens and it doesn't work out, because when we continue on a path of sin, inevitably, it's not going to work out. Problems are going to arise. Sin is meant to sever relationships. So problems are going to come up. And so when that happens, when we are encountered with those inevitable consequences, and we still don't acknowledge the wrong, then what do we often end up doing? Blame consequences on someone else. And so that's where we find Elijah. And here comes Elijah in their first meeting, and all these terrible things that Israel is experiencing is because of their false worship, because of their false ways. And yet Ahab says it's Elijah's fault. Is this you troubler of Israel? And of course, how does Elijah end up responding? He says, I have not troubled Israel, but you and your father's house have, because you have forsaken the commandments of the Lord, and you have followed the Baals. So I like what Elijah does here. He has really two classifications of the type of sins that Ahab is guilty of here. Does anybody know what I mean by that? Anybody want to take a stab as to what I mean by that? It's two kind of general categories when we talk about sin. Yeah.
One's a very general statement, the other one's very specific.
Yeah. I would put it this way. Ahab is guilty not only of sins of omission, but sins of commission. Most of us have heard that before. Does anybody want to explain exactly what that means? When we talk about sin, what's a sin of omission? What does it mean to omit something? Yeah, Ann.
Knowing the right thing to do and not doing it.
Right, and that can manifest itself in so many ways, right? You see somebody is doing what they shouldn't be doing. You're in a position where you can confront them about that, rebuke them, but still exhort them as a brother. And you just say, I'm not going to do that. That's way too hard of a conversation for me to have. You're in a situation where you have the opportunity to help somebody, and you're able to do so, and you decide not to do it. Sin of omission, right? And so that's what really Ahab is firstly guilty of. It says that he forsook the commandments of the Lord. In other words, God has all these things that he commanded Israel to do, and if they do them, then they'll be blessed. And what did Ahab do? Just walked away from him. He didn't do it. Sin of omission. But not only that, he's guilty of a sin of commission. And what's a sin of commission?
Willfully knowing.
Yeah, willfully knowing. In other words, sin of commission is when you do something wrong. In other words, sometimes we sin by not doing something, but then we sin by doing something, right? Getting drunk, that's a sin of commission, right? We're not supposed to get drunk. And so the specific sin that Ahab commits is he says, not only did you forsake the commandments of the Lord, but the sin of commission is you have followed the Baals. In other words, he's actively engaging in worshiping Baal. He's a disciple of Baal, actively following him. And he's not only doing that, but he's getting an entire nation of God's people to follow him. And I don't have time to go in. Tell you what, God takes blame as being shoveled on Elijah, but Elijah turns it around. He says, Ahab, look, here's the real situation. And he just tells him how it is. He says, here's what you're doing wrong, and this is what's causing your trouble here in Israel. What happened is one of the greatest stories in the Bible, isn't it? Elijah says, okay, we're going to deal with this. We're going to settle this once and for all. Because when you think about it, why is it that Ahab would say that Elijah is the troubler of Israel? It's almost like what he's saying is that the reason why all these terrible things are coming upon Israel is because he's worshiping Yahweh, and Ahab believes the one true God is Baal, right? Okay, we got a problem on our hands. You're pitting your God versus my God. And Elijah says, if that's how you want to play it, let's settle this right here, right now. And so that's what they're going to do. And so we continue reading in 1 Kings And in verse 19 here, he says, "Now then, send and gather to me all Israel at Mount Carmel, together with 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of the Asherah, who eat at Jezebel's table." And of course, we're going to see more and more how wicked Jezebel is. And so we continue reading. Just step here for a second. You look at Elijah, he's clearly being persecuted for just simply doing what's right. He's being persecuted for worshiping the one true God, right? And I think that's where we have to be mindful of things that are said, such as in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 11, when Jesus says, Blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward in heaven is great, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. In other words, there are going to be people who take issue with your faith in God. And there's going to be people who say that we are the troublemakers, like Ahab said to Elijah, because of our conviction in God. Do we not see that at least in the political realm, right? We see it when our kids go to school, that they're being taught something that isn't in line with the Bible, that isn't in line with their faith. The kids speak up and they get in trouble for it, right? We see that happen. But when we stay true to our beliefs, when we remain loyal to God, we know that that trouble is inevitably going to come. We know that people are going to insult us, but what does Jesus say? He says, blessed are you. He says, in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Is Elijah not being persecuted? Yeah, of course he is. In fact, after this, if Ahab wins, he's going to put Elijah to death. Right? And how do I know that? Well, because that's already what he's been doing. They had to hide prophets of God. The prophets are being persecuted. And it's because of their faith in the one true God. It's because of their refusal to tell the people what they want to hear and instead telling them the truth. And again, Elijah sticks to that. And he's going to be persecuted for it. But he lays down the gauntlet, really, to Ahab. He says, let's settle this once and for all. And this is going to take place on Mount Carmel. And I've been there, and this is a photo from Mount Carmel. You talk about mountains in the Bible, and a lot of times they're more hills for us here in the Pacific Northwest. We see these great mountains, snow-capped mountains. You don't see as much of that in Israel. You see kind of larger hills. And so this picture is taken from the top of Mount Carmel, and you can see right here, this is going to be facing towards the east, I believe, and that would be facing towards the Jezreel Valley, right, that he's eventually going to run across. And then if you look towards the west, you're going to see the Mediterranean Sea from the top of this. And of course, you go there today, and they've built, a sanctuary for that site. But they're, when you go to Israel, a lot of times they're like, they say things like, well, this is the proposed location, or we think that this is where this happened. But this is one of the few locations in Israel where they're pretty certain that this event that we're about to read about took place right here in this spot. And so that's Mount Carmel. sermons. I mean, listen to how applicable that is to today. How long will you hesitate between two opinions? I think New King James says, how long will you falter between two opinions, right? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, follow him. But the people did not answer him a word. And so I want you to see and notice, obviously, Elijah, he's urging them to do two things. He's urging them first to do what? Anybody?
Make a choice.
Make a choice. He's urging them to choose. Because the problem that's going on in Israel is that they're oscillating between two gods. And so when it comes to what they practice, it's really Baal worship is what they're practicing. But also on the flip side, they're aware of the Old Testament. They're aware of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and the promises that were made to them. They're aware of the promises that God made to Israel that they also read about. And so these things are in the back of their mind, but meantime, they're serving this false god. And so maybe to an extent, they have this kind of mental assent of Yahweh God, but that's not what they're living. That's not what they're practicing. And he says, how long are you going to hesitate between two opinions? And so he urges them to choose, but the second thing he urges them to do is what? Not just choose, but to do what? To follow. So in other words, they're not choosing right now, right? They're just hesitating. And so since they're hesitating between these two gods, what do we infer when it tells them to also follow God? We infer that because they're hesitating at all. It urges them not only to choose, but to follow. That's two different things. And the only way you can even begin to follow is if you first choose God. Now, but there comes a time where we have to just make a choice. How much evidence do we need? How many scriptures do we need to see? And I think sometimes we hide behind that. We hide behind the, this idea, I just need time, I just need time, I just need time. Eventually, I'll come to I'll make a choice. Well, Elijah's saying the time is now. The time is up. He says, how long will you go on limping between two different opinions? He says, if the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal, then follow him. It's time to make a decision. And how do the people answer? It says that they didn't answer him a word. Which, by the way, when you look at this, and it seems like I bring out this passage all the time, but no one can serve two masters, Matthew 6:24. If you're trying to serve two, you're not serving him at all. And then he also goes on to say, whoever is not with me is against me. In other words, you got to choose Jesus if we're going to be on his side. You have to make that mental commitment to do that. Yeah, Bruce?
I was going to say, part of the problem with making a choice is if you choose to follow God,
Yeah.
there's a strict set of rules.
Yeah.
If you choose to follow Baal and them, it's pretty wishy-washy. You can do kind of what you want, so it's a lot easier to go.
Not only that, but if they follow God, that means they got to rebel against the state, right? They got to rebel against the guy that's killing people of God. And that's not easy to do. But Elijah's saying, look, you still got to make a choice. But you're right. Today, that's so true. You're looking at a document that's telling you what's right and what's wrong, and it's making the decisions for you. God's making the decisions for you, rather than you determining for yourself what's right and what's wrong. And we could talk all day about the problems that enter into mankind when we are the ones that make the rules. It's not good. Just read the book of Judges. That's really a lot of time that I spent during the introduction of this class, is what happens when man interjects with God's plan. But yeah, it's a strict set of rules, and a lot of people, they look at it and they're offended by it because it says that they need to make a change that they don't want to make, and so they throw the whole thing away. But along with what Bruce said, and I think he kind of gave an answer to that question that I'm about to ask, But why do you suppose that the people didn't even answer Elijah a word? They didn't say a thing. Here he lays down the gauntlet, and he just lays it out very plainly to them. And they don't start yelling in uproar. They don't say okay, but they don't answer him a word.
Because I think they know, obviously, in their heart that what they're doing is wrong, but they can't admit they're wrong. And so you're silent.
Yeah.
When you're confronted, you either take silence because you know that you're wrong, and if I say something, then I got to commit, and they don't want to commit.
Yeah, silence is the easiest way to remain non-committal, isn't it? Like, it's almost like they acknowledge, oh, Elijah is making a pretty good point here. I am kind of trying to follow two at one time. I don't know what to say. Here's Ahab, who might kill me if I commit to God, but here's a prophet of God telling me that I need to give up Baal completely. I don't know what to say. JC in the back.
No, you went exactly to it.
Yeah.
It's very hard sometimes to see the physical manifestations of what God does in our lives, but it's very easy to watch your king wipe out hundreds of prophets of God physically in front of you. And so it's very intimidating to say, okay, yeah, I'll follow this person who I haven't seen anything physically do anything in my life to the detriment of my family around me.
Yeah.
God tells us, as you said, his word, it tells us what he expects from us. I think of not that long ago, when in Kentucky at the Creation Museum, and Ken Ham said something that just still sticks in my mind, and I can't seem to get it out. And he said, when you make your decisions in this life, whatever they may be, whatever decisions you make, you look at his word, and then you make your decision according to that. Is it in accordance with God's will? Yeah. Is the decision you're making, does it line up with his principles? Does it line up with what he stands for? And then you make your decision, whatever it may be. And boy, that is just solid advice.
Yeah, exactly. It reminds me of when I was in Little League or coach pitch, I can't remember. And maybe if you have kids that have played baseball at a young age, you've even seen this yourself. But when it comes to getting into that batter's box, a young boy can be very non-committal because you want to get in that batter's box because you want to hit a home run like you've seen Ken Griffey Jr. do. But at the same time, you're afraid you're going to get hit by the ball. And so you kind of do this 1 foot in, 1 foot out. And eventually you got to make the decision, hey, I'm just going to get in there and I'm going to swing for the fences. But the problem is when it comes to our relationship with God, there's so many people that just don't do that. They're afraid of being judged by their friends for following God. They're afraid of being judged by the king for following God. And so they got 1 foot in, 1 foot out. But Elijah, he's calling them out on the carpet for that. He's saying it's time to choose. It's time to get in or get out. Any other comments or questions before we keep reading here? Okay, we're going to keep reading. We're in we just finished verse 21 here. We'll kind of read through this here. So it says, then Elijah said to the people, I alone am left, a prophet of the Lord, but Baal's prophets are 450 men. 1 versus 450 is what he's saying. So they got the numbers, they got the home field advantage. He says, now let them give us 2 oxen and let them choose 1 ox for themselves and cut it up and place it on the wood. But put no fire under it, and I'll prepare the other ox and lay it on the wood, and I will not put a fire under it. And so Elijah's going on, and he's kind of defining the rules of what's about to go down here. In verse 24, he says, then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord, and the God who answers by fire, he is God. And all the people said, that is a good idea. I love that response. Like, they don't answer a word, and he's defining these rules, and they think it's a good idea at the time. And the thing is, it's a good idea for Elijah, but not so much for them, for the prophets of Baal. But he's going through and he's defining the rules. He says, look, here's what we're going to do. We're both going to offer up sacrifices. You're going to offer up an oxen. I'm going to make my offering to God. And whichever one is consumed with fire, because we're not going to set either on fire, and whichever one is consumed with fire from heaven, well, then we know who is God. And he's defining the rules, and the people say, sounds good to me. Seems straightforward enough. And it wouldn't have been a problem in the minds of those people of Israel following Baal, because as I mentioned before, Baal's the sun god. That's one way they identify him. He's also, again, identified as a storm god. And I think that there's even an ancient painting that they have where like Baal is like shooting thunder out of his hands or something like that. And so this should be easy, no problem for Baal, right? If you believe in Baal, that's what you're thinking. And so they say, sounds good. Well, we keep reading, and it's interesting what we read here. Sorry, I went too far. So Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, "Choose one ox for yourselves and prepare it first, for you are many. And call on the name of your God, but put no fire under it." Then they took the ox which was given them, and they prepared it, and called on the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, which, by the way, here's another advantage he gives them. He says, I'm even going to let you go first, right? I'm going to let you choose the oxen first. You can choose the best one, or the one that you seem as best. But I'm also going to let you go first, and then I'll go after you. So he's given them every advantage. But here it is in verse 26. It says that they prepared the oxen, and they called on the name of Baal from morning until noon, for several hours, right? And they're saying, "Oh, Baal, answer us." So you can imagine for several hours you have 450 prophets chanting, "Oh, Baal, worship us. Oh, Baal, or answer us. Oh, Baal, answer us." For several hours they're doing this. But there was no voice and no one answered. Well, that's interesting. And they leapt about the altar which they made. It came about at noon that Elijah mocked them and said, "Call out with a loud voice, for he is a god. Either he is occupied or gone inside, or is on a journey, or perhaps he is asleep and needs to be awakened." So what's Elijah doing? Mocking. Yeah, he's mocking. And so what do we think about that? We obviously generally think about mocking not being something that we should do. And I don't think that this passage gives us license to mock other people who aren't doing what they ought to be doing. And so what do we make out of what Elijah is doing here? Is Elijah wrong for what he's doing? Any thoughts on that? Oh, yeah, Jerry.
Aren't those direct answers to Baal myths about reasons in the past why he wasn't answering when they called him for a particular reason? It was because, Baal was busy over here on a journey with other people, mocking their reasons that they used for not answering.
Yeah, absolutely. So the interesting thing about some of these gods that they would worship, and it's not just Baal, but they would often have human attributes. And like sleeping, or like having to go to the bathroom. And so I think one translation translates it as perhaps he's relieving himself. And so he's mocking them. But even so, why is it that seems to be okay in this instance?
Well, I think what Elijah's doing here as well is bringing them to the point of complete commitment to what they are attributing their God can do. Mm-hmm. He's bringing them to that fever pitch, if you will, that they're all in. Mm-hmm. And then he's going to show them. Yep.
Okay, so picture in your mind for a second. You have 850 prophets total, right? Because you had 450 prophets of Baal, 400 Asherah prophets, versus one prophet. But it also says that all of Israel is gathered at this time. So you can just imagine how many people were present at this time. And you have these people that are trying to summon a God that doesn't exist. And when Elijah says these things, who is he saying them to? He's saying them to the people, but I think more specifically he's saying them to the prophets. And so I think that's important to note, that he's not just belittling somebody who has been deceived, but he's targeting the leaders of this religious movement. And he's calling them out on carpet, and he's trying to get the rest of Israel to see, because this is on display. It's going to be a huge embarrassment for the prophets of Baal. And he's trying to get them to see, look how silly this religion is. I am mocking your God right now, and nothing is happening. I should be struck dead. I know he doesn't say that, but isn't that what should happen? Yeah, Eric.
You said embarrassing. I would go even further than that. He's
Yeah.
Because they've been altering between these two choices, and they didn't answer him when he asked that question because they knew full well deep down Baal wasn't going to do anything in this moment because he literally can't. So he is shaming them, and this ties in with the Hebrews Wednesday night study. This is God disciplining his people because they have repeatedly forsaken him to go do these other things, and now, and if these words and these questions of Elijah aren't embarrassing or shameful enough, just wait until it's Elijah's turn at his altar, right?
Yep.
And what happens immediately.
Exactly. And we'll study that next week, but I want to finish real quick. I appreciate that, Eric. Yeah, it is. He's shaming them. It's more than just an embarrassment. It's shaming them openly. But in verse 28, after he kind of mocks them like that, it says that the prophets of Baal, they cried with a loud voice and cut themselves according to their custom with swords and lances until blood gushed out on them. And when midday was past, they raved until the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice, but there was no voice. No one answered, and no one paid attention. You see that there's the time thing. They're perhaps chanting, "Oh, Baal, answer us." Elijah mocks them, and so now what do? They cut themselves, and they're just putting everything into it. They say, "He's not answering us. I'm going to put more emotion into this. We're going to worship him longer. We're going to worship him until the evening." And what happens? Nothing. And I think what I take away from that is pouring more emotion into worship, pouring more words into worship, isn't going to do anything if we're not worshiping in truth and in spirit, if we're not worshiping the true God the way he wants to be worshiped. And what we're going to see next week is a complete contrast when it comes to their approach compared to Elijah's approach and how much simpler it is as he calls out and worships his God. We didn't get as far as I wanted to get, but that's okay. This is a huge chapter. Thanks for your time and thanks for your comments.